The red house stood bathed in the golden glow of a late summer afternoon. Sunbeams danced on the well-manicured lawns, painting playful patterns on the vibrant flower beds. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of roses, creating an atmosphere of serene tranquility. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed thrice, its resonant tones echoing through the silent house. Mrs. Stevens, her plump figure bustling with quiet efficiency, dusted the antique furniture in the drawing room. Her lips moved silently, humming a cheerful tune that harmonized with the peaceful rhythm of the day. On the veranda, young Audrey, her niece, sat with a book in her lap, her gaze lost in the captivating world of literature. She too seemed to be lulled by the tranquility of the afternoon, her face reflecting the calmness of the day. Mrs. Stevens and Audrey were the only permanent residents of the Red House. Mrs. Stevens, a woman of unwavering loyalty and dedication, had served the family for decades. She had witnessed the comings and goings of various family members, the laughter and tears that echoed through the halls, the joys and sorrows that had unfolded within those walls. Audrey, a bright and curious girl in her late teens, had come to live with her aunt after her parents' untimely demise. The Red House, despite its grandeur and elegance, felt empty without a bustling family to fill its many rooms. Mrs. Stevens and Audrey, in their own quiet ways, had become the caretakers of its tranquility, their presence a comforting constant in the face of its inherent emptiness. Their days were filled with a familiar routine: cleaning, cooking, gardening, tasks that they performed with an unspoken understanding and a shared love for their home. The arrival of the letter shattered the peace of the afternoon like a stone thrown into a still pond. The postman's ring, usually a mundane sound, echoed with an unfamiliar urgency that afternoon. Mrs. Stevens, her hands still dusted with flour from her baking, accepted the letter with a puzzled frown. It was addressed in a hand she did not recognize, the handwriting elegant yet slightly faded, as if written after many years of disuse.
"Audrey, dear, come here for a moment."
Mrs. Stevens called out, her voice laced with a hint of bewilderment. Audrey, startled from her reading, looked up, her brows furrowed in question.
"This letter, it's addressed to Master Edward."
The name hung in the air, a whisper from a past long forgotten. Edward, the youngest of the siblings, had left home 15 years ago, under a cloud of mystery and unspoken sorrow. His name was rarely mentioned, a taboo subject that lingered like a ghost in the corridors of the Red House.
Edward? But we haven't heard from him in years. Do you think he's finally coming home?
Her voice was a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The thought of her enigmatic uncle, a figure shrouded in whispers and half-remembered stories, returning to the Red House after all these years, sent a shiver down her spine. Before Mrs. Stevens could reply, a shadow fell across the doorway. A man stood at the entrance, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the glare of the afternoon sun. He wore a long coat, buttoned up to his chin despite the warmth of the day, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow.
"Good afternoon, I believe this is the Red House?"
His words were polite, but there was an underlying current of tension, an air of barely concealed impatience that did not escape Audrey's notice.
"Yes, it is."
Mrs. Stevens responded cautiously, her gaze flickering from the stranger's face to the letter clutched in her hand.
"And you are?"
The man removed his hat, revealing a head of dark, unruly hair streaked with silver, and eyes that were startlingly blue in the afternoon light.
"Edward,"
he said simply, his gaze sweeping over the women with an intensity that made Audrey shift uneasily.
"Edward Blackwood."
The silence that followed his declaration was thick with unspoken emotions. Mrs. Stevens gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Edward, their long-lost Edward, had finally returned, but the years had etched lines of weariness on his face, and his eyes, once filled with youthful exuberance, now held a haunted, almost hunted look. Audrey, her heart pounding in her chest, could only stare at her uncle, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the man before her with the hazy memories of the boy he had once been. Edward's return was not the joyous reunion that Audrey had, perhaps naively, envisioned. He was withdrawn, his silences punctuated by cryptic remarks and fleeting smiles that failed to reach his eyes. He spent hours closeted in his old room, a space that had remained untouched since his departure, filled with the dusty relics of his childhood. Audrey would often find him staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if searching for answers in the ever-changing patterns of the clouds. The once peaceful atmosphere of the Red House was now charged with an undercurrent of unease.
Her cheerful demeanour, replaced by a worried frown, moved about her tasks with uncharacteristic quietness.
Audrey, her initial curiosity now tinged with a growing sense of foreboding, found herself constantly watching her uncle trying to decipher the enigma that was Edward Blackwood. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Mrs. Stevens, in an attempt to lighten the mood, had prepared all of Edward's favourite dishes, but the aroma of roast chicken and apple pie did little to dispel the tension that hung heavy in the air. Edward ate little, pushing the food around his plate with a distinct lack of appetite. His infrequent attempts at conversation were met with awkward silences, his words cryptic and laced with a bitterness that made Audrey squirm in her chair.
You haven't told us why you've come back, Edward.
Mrs. Stevens finally ventured, her voice hesitant as if afraid of the answer. Edward looked up sharply, his blue eyes suddenly piercing in the candlelight.
That is a long story, Mrs. Stevens, and one I'm not quite ready to tell.
His words, delivered with a chilling finality, hung in the air long after he had spoken, casting a pall over the remainder of the meal. Section 8. A midnight scream. Terror grips the Red House. The grandfather clock had just struck midnight when a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence of the Red House. Audrey, jolted awake, sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The scream, filled with raw terror, seemed to reverberate through the house, echoing in the stillness of the night. For a moment she sat frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then, throwing back the covers, she scrambled out of bed and raced into the hallway. The hallway was plunged in darkness, the only light emanating from a single flickering gas lamp. Shadows danced menacingly on the walls, amplifying the sense of dread that had settled over the house. Audrey, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, made her way cautiously towards the source of the scream, Mrs. Stevens' room. Section 9. The search for Mrs. Stevens. Panic in the darkness. Audrey's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Pushing the door open, she stepped into the room, her breath catching in her throat. Mrs. Stevens' room was in disarray, the bedclothes in a heap on the floor, overturned lamps casting grotesque shadows on the walls. But it was the sight of Mrs. Stevens herself that sent a wave of terror crashing over Audrey. Her aunt lay sprawled on the floor, her eyes wide with fear, her face ashen. She was still alive, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, but she seemed to be in a state of utter shock. Section 10. Confrontation and Chaos. Unveiling the Truth. Audrey's gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of an intruder, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. As her eyes fell on the open window, a cold draft sending a shiver down her spine, a terrifying thought occurred to her. Could Edward be involved in this? The thought, though preposterous at first, took root in her mind, fueled by her uncle's strange behavior and the palpable tension that had gripped the Red House since his arrival.
Just then, Edward appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice edged with an urgency that Audrey found both reassuring and unsettling.
It was him, Mrs. Stevens finally choked out, her voice trembling. The man in the garden. He was here. Her words, disjointed and laced with terror, did little to clarify the situation. But one thing was clear. There was more to Edward's return than met the eye, and the Red House, once a sanctuary of peace, had become a battleground for secrets best left buried.
Section 11. The Aftermath, A Changed Red House. The events of that night cast a long shadow over the Red House. The police were called, but the intruder, the man in the garden, was never found. Mrs. Stevens, though physically unharmed, was deeply shaken, the terror of that night etched into her eyes. Edward, his initial concern replaced by a brooding silence, offered no explanations, his motives and actions remaining as much of a mystery as the events of that night. The Red House, once a symbol of warmth and tranquility, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The laughter and light-hearted banter that had once filled its halls were replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated by the creaking floorboards and the rustling of leaves outside. The truth of that night, like the identity of the intruder and the reason for Edward's return, remained elusive, a puzzle with missing pieces, leaving behind an unsettling sense of unease and a lingering fear that refused to be ignored. The Red House and those who resided within its walls were forever changed. The tranquility they had once known was gone, replaced by a haunting reminder that even in the safest of havens, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface.